like to thank you for allowing me into your homes for this 12th episode of Season 2 of Esoteric Science Roundtable. This is my first live show since the new year, and I would hope that the new year has been productive for all of you thus far. On my last live show on December 26th, I spoke about the Essenes, and that is a group to which Jesus was born into according to esoteric tradition. And as a result of that show, I did receive some interesting responses in some respects regarding the subject of the Essenes. And so as a result of that, I definitely feel that I have touched upon some deep and profound truths, and that my education of the Essenes is really only just beginning. I'd like to thank also the individual that took the time to send me this information about a particular group that has a philosophy based on the Essene teachings, and also some of the guest speakers that were mentioned in this literature that also have philosophies and organizations based on the Essene way of life. And I had really no idea that it was that comprehensive and that so many people from a background of education and people that you wouldn't normally think that would be into this, doctors and people like that have adopted this philosophy as a way of life and have started these organizations based around the Essene teachings. And so, again, I feel like I have touched upon some profound truths, and I will try to cover some more things on the Essenes as my education is more fulfilled in the future, and hopefully I can enlighten and bring some more elucidation to some of this for future shows as well. Excuse me. One thing that I wanted to touch upon that is a definite point of concern that I heard courtesy of a very good source, which is Alex Jones, and that is that Channel 10 in the Cedar Park area is no longer broadcasting the programming from Access on Channel 10. They've switched it to something else apparently, and so this is something that's a definite point of concern as far as I'm concerned, and it's something that we should all be aware of as Access producers and people that are fond of the programming that's put on Access. If we would please keep this in mind, that if this is indeed going to be a sign of things to come, we definitely need to try to head this off at the pass as much as possible and not just lie down as they start to nitpick and decimate really the broadcast area of Access, and to limit any further outreach of the programming down here. It really goes to show how powerful Access truly is if indeed this is going to be a permanent fixture in this area in Cedar Park. And so if there are still people viewing in that area, I would ask you to please check with your neighbors and what have you to see if those other individuals are still able to get the program, and try to kind of work in your area if indeed this is a point of interest to you, because this could easily take place and they could start, like I said, decimating and picking apart the viewing area for any number of reasons. So we should be concerned about these sort of things. Excuse me. This third Wednesday of this month is the 15th, and that is going to be the metaphysical and philosophical meeting that we host and co-host with Jeff Contreras from Therefore I Am. And again, it's going to be the 15th of this month at Opal Divine, starting at around 8 o'clock. Completely free, very casual, just talking about a number of things related to what we discuss on our respective shows, ideas of philosophy, metaphysics, politics most assuredly always creeps in as well. And so it's just a pretty casual opportunity to speak to both Jeff and myself, and just find like-minded people that have similar interests in these topics to kind of bounce these ideas off one another. And so again, at Opal Divine's, the 15th of this month will be the meeting. Let's see, to get on to today's actual topic, the topic that I've entitled today's show is the thinning of the veil. And to flesh that out a bit, to start, what is the veil, and what is meant by that term veil? When we think of a veil, certainly it's something that hides or conceals from one, possibly a compartment to the next or what have you, but basically indicating some sort of a separation of this veil. And so that being the case, there are veils that exist between worlds and exist between conditions of consciousness and that exist between vibrational rates. And so we can find that there is a veil that exists between our dense physical vehicle and the energy body, or the so-called etheric body, and that as if a person were to be able to refine his sight, for instance, that he could ratchet up his sight and be able to take into that vision the etheric body, and then on from there to be able to encompass the astral and then the mental. Now, certainly our physical eyes would not be able to perceive the rarefied matter that comprises these different planes. These planes are too refined for us to see and understand with the physical sensations, and so we have to be in the proper body, if you will, in order to understand and move within those areas. And so we have an etheric or energy body, we have an astral or emotional body, and we have a mental body as well. And so in each of these respective bodies, we can move and work on these different levels and have consciousness and understanding and work with some intelligence. Excuse me. And so again, this veil that exists between worlds or between dimensions, if, as some like to use that term, that definitely exists, goes through different conditions, and it can be thinned. Other terms would be rent or torn. And in other words, that it can be pierced. This veil can be pierced in that we can see or experience what is on the other side of the veil. And this also does kind of tie into what Jeff has spoken about on his show, and that I've talked about somewhat as well, which is the different veils of perception, of understanding, of having, again, a level of conscious understanding, and how that expands and proceeds with this increased capacity to bring in this more encompassing vision of what's out there, that there is much unseen that we are not aware of that hides just outside of our physical senses, and that we can truly reach through these veils and bring forth information and interact and actively interact with these entities and whatever terms that you'd like to choose that actually inhabit the other side of the veil, if you want to use that symbolism. And to begin with, I want to touch upon some of the reasons for the thinning or the renting of the veil. Now, part of this has to do with actual physical plane events that have led to, again, a tearing, a piercing of the veil that has allowed for certain transmission of energies and a certain exchange to take place between, again, these different dimensional levels or different levels of vibration, that by virtue of this tearing and piercing through the veil, our physical veil that prevents us from understanding and seeing what's more refined and ultimately more spiritual. The more spiritual or the inner plane, what are often termed the inner plane activities. We really aren't fully understanding of that, except in instances of the person after they've died, then they have obviously active experience on the inner planes. And also in the dream state, when we dream at night, we also find ourselves, and there are other instances as well, but primarily the veil that we work on is our physical plane veil, and that's what we're aware of as far as our waking day consciousness to a large degree for most individuals. And it's only until we begin to understand about the quality of vibration and the understanding of how comprehensive this whole vast and grand scheme of things truly is, and how wide and diverse and varied all creation is, and how multi-leveled it is, and that all things in creation are not readily apparent to our physical senses, and there are many things that are in creation that are just outside of the realm of the physical, but yet we can still have some understanding, some perception of these things as we build in the proper perception and build in the proper tools, both within ourselves and also external tools that we can use to measure these activities and have a more well-rounded understanding based on both an inner intuition and a scientific approach to this body of knowledge. And so I would like to speak about the World War. World War I and World War II are oftentimes portrayed in esoteric writings and what have you, as one war, as a continuation of one war that had a rest period between, obviously, the main focus of the action, but nonetheless that this period of war between 1914 to 1945 was roughly one impulse caused both wars, in other words, is one way to put it. And that the spiritual causes that led to this physical plane activity have to be taken into account to get a fuller understanding and to see the more comprehensive picture as to why the World War broke out. Why did World War I and World War II break out? And certainly we can look at the political aspects of that, and I will touch upon that somewhat as well to kind of tie that in and get a fuller understanding of that all. But nonetheless, there are always spiritual causes that start on the so-called mental plane that filter and work themselves down through our emotional plane, down through the energy plane, and finally, ultimately down into physical activation, some kind of physical expression. And so this trickling down effect from the causative level to the physical plane can be traced, and we can find the thread that runs from the cause to the effect. And that is really one of the main things that esoteric science is basically based around, and the whole teachings is built around demonstrating that principle as well as a lot of other principles, but basically how to interpret, understand, and implement divine law. And certainly the law of cause and effect is a very key component to divine law. And so to understand and implement that in our daily lives is part of the work at hand for us if we understand it and can take charge of that responsibility and move forward with that knowledge. So again, considering the World War and what took place. Now, if we start to consider first strictly the physical plane aspects of it, now certainly many historians would understand and acknowledge that the World War started in 1914 with Austria declaring war on Serbia on July 28th. And also the assassination that took place that was popularly considered to be the originating cause that led to this conflagration, on a world scale. And so very shortly afterwards, Woodrow Wilson, the United States president, announces our neutrality on August 4th. And so at that point, we have no intention of getting into this world conflict. And then nonetheless, though, we can make ourselves aware of the behind the scenes, and not the inner plane so much, but the behind the scenes as far as our shadow operations, the black ops, and those that wish to enslave us, those that work behind the scenes with the so-called left-hand path and what would commonly be termed evil in many people's opinion. And so we find that there are these individuals that somehow found the motivation to fund, finance, and to be affiliated with these acts of enterprise that provided the firepower for the war machine. And we can name names of individuals, or it's relatively well documented as far as who the individuals were that did take the time to, again, finance ultimately both sides. But what was their motivation for financing this war machine? Certainly we could look at the selfish aspects of it, and perhaps they were just trying to, line their own coffers and fill their own purses with this war money, this blood money. And we can see also how the war was proliferated and perpetuated by this exchange. If there weren't any companies to build the tanks and build the guns and create the ammunition and create the means of war, certainly there would be no war. Or there would be war not in the sense that we understand it. So that being the case, there had to be these individuals that funded the war effort on both sides. And again, to try to understand how did they get latched on to this ideal, this understanding, and how did they become a part of this war mechanism. Some of these people that are propped up oftentimes as idealists and as those that were philanthropists in many instances were those that, on the other hand, were those that were financing this war effort. And it's difficult in some people's estimation to justify how that could possibly be. And so that is a curious thing to consider. And so again, these individuals that move behind the scenes, that seem to have no particular allegiance to any one sovereign nation. They seem to be, again, transnational or multinational in scope, and so they weren't caught up again with an allegiance to any particular nationality, and so they were very free, both in conscience and activity, to, again, fund this war effort on all sides. And there is much, again, documentation that provides the who's, the whens, the whys, and well, maybe not so much the whys, but who these people were that were doing the financing. And certainly that all ties back to the banking aspect as well, that the financiers were the ones ultimately that have to loan countries money so that they can build the war machines in their respective areas to wage this mass campaign. Now, also, we can go into the more historical aspects of World War I, and we can discuss the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 and also the Sussex in 1916, and the further goading by the Germans until we entered the conflict in 1917, and ultimately until the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, when that portion of the war officially ended. Now, again, to look past the physical plane aspects to the causative nature of this. What was it that caused these financiers and these industrialists to jump on this impulse, even though they knew they were funding, again, a war effort? Ultimately, it has to do with a couple of aspects that I have to put in general terms because it's difficult to really get into too much detail. But ultimately, a condition of world karma had existed and built itself up from previous activity. And so mankind's own selfishness, ruthlessness, greed, and destructive nature from ages past, from far into antiquity, had accumulated and built itself up and amalgamated into a very thick condition, a very overbrooding and overcasting kind of situation. We could look at it as a dark cloud just cast over humanity that was keeping us in the dark, if you will. We can use that analogy. And so this world karma, if you will, and also in allegiance with what is sometimes termed cosmic evil or extraplanetary influences that are not originating on our globe Earth, but nonetheless come to interact with the activity taking place on this globe. And by no means, make no mistake about the import of this small little speck in space. We truly do have great work to carry out, and there is much significance and import to our globe and what's taking place now. And we are a subject of great interest to many individuals at many levels of consciousness, again, both inhabiting our globe and those that are extraplanetary or outside of the globe that have a stake or an understanding in what's taking place. And so they're observing what's going on right now. And so, again, this world karma and this cosmic evil, so-called, or extraplanetary influence that mankind has readily latched onto, both through his ignorance and misunderstanding and his selfishness and greed. These have allowed us to invite a psychic vampire, if you will, to come into our planet and to leech off of our planet. Also, when we look at the causes behind the World War, our evolutionary process has to go forward. And so when old forms are no longer fit and proper for the existence of current intelligence, then things have to change in order for that intelligence to find the proper vessel to work through. And so our evolving humanity has to find the vessels, the vehicles that to work through in order to do the work of evolution. And so we have to have proper and fit vessels that are meeting the high standards of our age now, so that we can accumulate even further understanding and move farther along in this process as we are able to understand and interpret it. Also, this whole concept again of this new order, this new world order that has constantly been creeping down and precipitating down into the consciousness of men, and that has infiltrated the thinking and many areas of human endeavor, that this new idea of order on a global and vast scale is again permeating and pervading the minds of men to such a degree as it has not really done in many, 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 many long aeons of time. And so we see this resurgence, but on a higher turn of the spiral, as it is called esoterically, in that this is a more refined repeating of a previous condition, when we see people more interested in, again, a world outlook, a global outlook, and what individuals can do to have a greater global perspective, but not neglecting their own backyards. You know, you have to get your own house in order first, and then we can expand out and have a greater role in this helping of humanity, this salvaging of the race that is part and parcel of this cyclic necessity. Again, mankind having to be faced with a tremendous amount of world karma that we ourselves, through many, many lives, have built up. And whether you choose to believe in reincarnation or not, these events have somehow found their way into existence, and so we have to deal with them. Whether you want to blame it on your forefathers and their ignorance and their misunderstanding, I would say that is part of our ignorance and misunderstanding to blame it on earlier individuals, as these earlier individuals were indeed ourselves, and so we are only blaming ourselves for anything in the past ultimately. And that's, the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can make real progress as far as understanding how to correct these things, understanding what our responsibility is, what the work at hand is, and how to act and move forward in a responsible fashion, again, for the helping and salvaging of the race. Excuse me. Now, following again into World War II and the aggression by the Axis countries, and again, we're wondering, how do these individuals come into power? How does a Hitler or Mussolini come into power and completely sway the minds of the masses and completely have people eating out of their hands for all intents and purposes by introducing some philosophy and by having somewhat of a charismatic character in nature, whether they were a ruthless dictator or not? They somehow were able to appeal to the masses and hammer home some ideal that these individuals collectively, you know, gathered towards and felt the need to bring it to expression. And so we see this taking place again, this accumulation of these ideologies during the World War in the second phase, this Second World War. And so again, this energy finds itself amalgamating, and again we find American financial assistance to build the war machine on both ends, the financial and the industrial that are needed to build the war machine. Now, it's very difficult to understand, let alone to justify how individuals could do this, and how individuals that we could name were cited with trading with the enemy during these times of war. Excuse me. And how can we get a grasp on that? What was their thinking? You know, were these individuals traitors? Well, certainly many people would feel that way, and common sense would dictate that, yes, these individuals were traitors. What is it that caused them to want to, again, go against the nation that they lived in order to finance the opposition? You know, how could they live with themselves, and how could this happen? We have to understand, again, cyclic impulse, and how this impression reaches the minds of men, and certainly those in positions of power are certainly impressed upon, in many instances, much more than those that are of little influence, because those that work behind the scenes to guide and watch over the race find the necessity to work again with those that are influential, because those are the ones that are going to be able to be the policymakers, the movers and the shakers, that are going to be able to get this ideology to filter down further. Now again, when we consider the whole concept that new wine cannot be put into old skins, we have to have something new and proper for this new modality, this new methodology, and this new unfoldment of human consciousness. And so we have to make adequate the way and the means for that. And so we find that these energies work themselves into active expression in our physical plane, so that these things can work themselves out. And we see the physical results, but we don't always understand the causative nature and the original originating aspects that lead to these physical plane events. And so again, it's key to try to consider where these things come from and what is the causative factors to give us greater understanding. Now, I would like to mention Franklin Roosevelt. He was elected in large part for promising to keep America out of the war or the conflict that became known as World War II. And we could just as easily consider Churchill and others, but in this particular respect, I want to concentrate on Roosevelt being the leader of the American forces and generally symbolizing the leader of the free world and symbolizing the leader of the Allied nations, whereas Hitler would generally be considered to symbolize the Axis powers, even though you would have to factor in the Mussolini and the Japanese individuals and all the other movers and shakers that were a part of that organization and affiliation to try to bring forth a totalitarian state, really. And so Roosevelt, if we consider what were his motivations. Now, we know he was elected with a promise not to enter the war, but we also, if we study enough and understand, we can find through different writings and different areas that Franklin Roosevelt was considered a disciple to these teachers on the inner planes, a disciple to Christ in the Church Invisible, to those that are termed the Masters of Wisdom, or the hierarchy, the many names that this group of individuals goes by, and this body of working individuals that have achieved perfection, relatively speaking, as far as humanity is concerned, and how they would find favor in some of the activities that took place, and how would they be able to condone some of what took place. It's very curious to consider these things. And why would, again, Roosevelt be considered a disciple? Now, studying through history, we understand that at the very least, Franklin Roosevelt was in touch with the masters, so-called, at the very least through the Roricks, through Nicholas and Helena Roerich, who were students of some of these masters, and how through this contact, at the very least, Roosevelt would have been in contact with these masters through contact with the Roricks. And so there was this interplane connection to Roosevelt directly. And then we have to consider also that conversely, on the left-hand path, or the path of involution, the path of descent into matter, that there was an equal, not equal, I won't use that term, not equal, but an opposing force that was manifesting itself through Hitler and through the Axis powers, and that it had its own teachers, directors, those individuals that were entrusted to bring out that aspect of a greater plan for humanity and human evolution. And that so we see that just like the yin and the yang, that light and dark, the contrast from these opposing forces make a totality. And we can't neglect one in light of the other. We have to look at all things in their totality to understand the complexity of all of this, and understand that Hitler also had his contacts on the inner planes with individuals that allowed him to gain greater power and to terrorize individuals with even more efficiency and capacity. And so we understand this wrangling and working out more so. Now, another instance to consider is from the biography of a woman named Vera Stanley Alder. She wrote a biography called From the Mundane to the Magnificent. And during one of her accounts, in which she recounts taking instruction through one of these masters, and that he enabled her to leave the physical body and instruct her on how to leave the physical body. And so they would leave and they would travel, and he would show her things and teach her through analogy by going and visiting, again, these other planes, and so that she could have an understanding and learn more so of what was going on, and so she could be a more capable servant of the race. And so in her autobiography, From the Mundane to the Magnificent, she speaks of one of these encounters where she's going through these inner planes with the master that's instructing her in this instance. And she sees someone that she says looks remarkably like Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, conversing with someone that looks remarkably like Hitler. And so when we understand at the inner planes, there is a working out in that sense, that there would be a merging of these two seemingly opposing factors at that level, because this is, again, the causative level. And this energy, generally, especially what is known as first-ray energy, or what's also known as the will of God, this first-ray energy, as it comes down into manifestation, ultimately can be either destructive or synthetic. It has both of those qualities. And so, that being the case, we can see how the first ray would be influencing and directing, and that both Roosevelt and Hitler would be under a first ray influence, and that this destructive and synthetic approach would have to be married, if you will, for our further evolution on the physical plane, and what would ultimately shake out into a new world order that we could really see taking shape after the end of the World War in 1945 and the implementation of the Marshall Plan and all of the subsequent planning to, again, restructure the existing national boundaries and to restructure political ideology and a whole reshaping of ideology on a global scale that we see take place after the World War. And so that's part of that as well. And that these individuals just latched on to this impulse. And so we can find that in the instance of the financiers, and we can find that in the instance of those industrialists on all sides that got caught up in this ray and that were swept along with this largely outside of their understanding in most instances, and largely outside of their conscious understanding, that enabled them or caused them, influenced them would probably be the best word, to do these activities, even though they would largely be termed evil or traitorous by many or most individuals. And so again, we have to look at these people's motivating factors. What did ultimately cause them to follow this path and to do these things that we would consider not very nice ultimately. Also to consider Franklin again, Franklin Roosevelt rather, if we consider why, if he knew, and this is pretty largely substantiated through history these days as well, why would he, if he knew about the coming attack to Pearl Harbor, why would he allow that to take place? Why would he allow those individuals to lose their lives? And why would also, in the case of the Philippines, the American families that were left in the Philippines, left at the mercy of the Japanese and left behind by the American ships, why was this allowed to happen when, again, history generally concedes that Franklin Roosevelt did know and was aware that these things happened? How can we justify this? How can we condone his activities? We have to take a look again at the inner planes to the soul of all of these individuals that were part of a larger group work, if you will, and that these individuals that were at Pearl Harbor, and the individuals in the case of the people that were left behind in the Philippines, and we do have survivors in both instances that have come forward to tell the tale of history and to, keep that aspect of it alive for us, so that we do have a fuller understanding of what took place, so that we ultimately do have to come face to face with these difficult truths and try to have some understanding why these things happen, and how can those on the inner planes, those that watch and guide over the race, let these things happen. Certainly we factor in human free will, and that is a large factor. They have their hands largely tied to a large degree because they're bound to certain laws, divine laws, and so they cannot interfere with our free will, although they can hint, they can give an innuendo, they can nudge, they can direct, but they do not interfere, and so their hands are tied. So they, again, even though they may have influenced, and they certainly did influence these individuals, why? Why would they work with these people? Well, again, when we understand these rays, so-called, especially the first ray, it's not exclusively synthetic, it's not exclusively destructive, it's both. And many individuals throughout history have latched on to that understanding. And so they are able to use this energy for their own, in some instances, selfish, and in some instances, altruistic or helpful motives. So we see them making use of that energy. But again, the idea of the sacrifice of these souls, why would that willingly happen? Why would that knowingly take place? We have to understand on the inner planes, these souls were part of a larger work because Roosevelt knew that we had to enter the war, and the inner plane teachers also emphasized in the literature of the times that there should be no neutrality, that because we let this evil, so-called, get to the point where it was rampant and out of control, that humanity, through its own ignorance and neglect and misunderstanding and greed, let this get to the point where it was getting out of hand. And so it manifested into a Hitler versus the Allied powers. Excuse me. And so, that being the case, with this energy, again, taking place in the sides being set for this energy to come to the earth plane, again, individual souls, the soul being all-knowing, relatively speaking, it's just in the instance of a plane crash, if you want to consider that analogy. 200 people are not going to get on a plane, 200 souls are not going to get on a plane together knowingly, because again, at that level, the soul knows that this is the end and that this physical life is going to end in a plane crash. And so there is a larger understanding, there's a larger working behind the scenes, and very much so in the event of those that sacrificed, and I would say knowingly and willingly, at the interplane level, both in the event of a Pearl Harbor and in this event in the Philippines, in which we had to have some sort of a pretext, some sort of reason to enter the World War. We had to have a graphic example. We had to be attacked, essentially, in order to enter the World War. But again, these individuals realized the necessity of America getting involved in the war. Now, it really was something that we really couldn't overlook it at that point. We had to be involved. It's as grim and as negative and as bad as the war was, and the amount of life that was lost. This all takes place as far as from the inner plane understanding to allow us to have this fuller expression to come forward. And so again, if we understand the first ray, how it comes and influences us, normally the way that this operates is that there is a step-down process in which energy finds its way, sort of in the sense of a step-down transformer, if anybody's familiar with the electronic terminology, that you have to, if you have a very powerful source, you have to step it down in order to make it usable at a lower level. You can't just have the full force of the energy go into the lower level, because it will destroy and obliterate. And that, again, is one of the qualities of the first ray. And so, generally speaking, this has to be stepped down. And we see that this first ray influence has come to humanity throughout time, but it has been allowed to come to humanity outside of the step-down process without being put through other filtering processes in which, in that it normally would be in the case of being filtered through the hierarchy and these other individuals that can, again, take this energy, step it down, and make it less potent and more useful for us on our earth plane. But in some instances, we have gotten a so-called direct shot of this Shambhala, or first ray, or will of God influence directly into humanity, directly into the hearts and minds of the human family. And so we see the results of that. Shortly before the World War, we find that humanity did receive this Shambhala influence, this first ray influence. Also, if we look forward into another time in our history, in 1975, we also received a Shambhala influence. And we can take the time to see what cropped up around this first ray influence as it came directly from the will of God, directly to humanity, without the mediation of Christ and the Church Invisible. We did not have to go through the Son to receive the Father in every instance, as mankind has proved himself more specialized. And that may seem blasphemous to some also, but nonetheless, Christ did demonstrate the way to the Father, and he did say through him was the way to the Father, but humanity has built into himself a lot of the aspects that Christ built into himself, or excuse me, that Jesus built into himself through Christ. And so we have access to that now. And so that is why through our evolution, we can now take a direct charge of Shambhala influence. Now, lastly, the most recent influence we had was in 2000. And what was the world event that we can point to that was a destructive and ultimately hopefully synthetic event that took place as a result of that. Well, that was the World Trade Center bombing. That, we can see the same set of circumstances setting themselves up, that we get these different factions, these different parties that latch onto this first-ray influence, and they feel the need to have this expression at some level. They feel the need to bring forth something based on this influence. And a lot of times, again, largely it's outside of their conscious understanding that they bring this forward. But nonetheless, mankind is influenced by this, again, first-ray influence, or this will of God influence. And these are the types of things that may manifest and come into physical expression as a result. Again, is it bad or good necessarily? Well, we can't really put it in those terms. We have to look at it as, again, an unfolding process, and that humanity has outgrown what was old, and that, again, the new skin has to be, new wine has to be put into new skins. We cannot put new wine into old skins, and so things have to be rebuilt and restructured in order to be adequate for our means of expression into the future. And so we see that, again, as part of this renting of the veil, this tearing of the veil, and as a result, what we see being able to pierce through the veil, what is on the other side of the veil, and how, as time goes by, increasingly so, and really exponentially so now, this is really, really quickening for us now, that the veils are thinning more rapidly, and that we have an opportunity to really pierce through these veils full force, and to take advantage of this exchange between worlds, if you will, and that we can use that to our benefit for our further evolution. So I would like to go ahead and grab a couple calls, see what's going on this evening. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Hello?
Hi, how are you? Go ahead.
Hi. I'm afraid this is off the subject, but I just wondered, did you ever hear from the walk-in woman?
I'm sorry, the
walk-in woman.
I did hear from the walk-in woman, as a matter of fact, and that is part of what I spoke about when I started the show. Is this Virginia?
Yeah.
Okay, then. I see. I recognize your voice. I recognize your voice, girl. You got to be careful about that. Anyway, hey, thanks for calling, by the way. As I mentioned in the first of the show, some interesting things that happened as a response to that show. Yes, I did meet with that woman, and she had some very interesting things to say, and I'll elaborate more so on the meeting. Some of it was a little bit personal and what have you, and it was very strange also because the walk-in woman that I met with re-emphasized things that another woman that I met with previously told me under similar circumstances that mirrored very much what this walk-in woman was telling me. And so I don't think that they've ever met. I don't think they've ever exchanged this information. So to me, the coincidence is there's no coincidence involved. To me, there was definitely something to it. And I'll expound upon that more so in the meeting if you want to hear about that more so. But definitely, it was very interesting, and I'll have to get into that more so. Yeah, a very interesting meeting, and again, a lot of opportunities I see opening up as a result of some of these things that are going on.
Well, I wish you would do a show on walk-in people, because that just sounded really interesting.
Well, I may have to do that. I have to consider that. That's not a bad topic. Yeah. But have a nice evening, and I'll talk to you soon.
Wait a minute.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, she seemed like kind of a benevolent person. Well, are there also people who are not so benevolent?
Okay, the opposite of a benevolent walk-in would be a possession or an obsession. Obsession being the lesser, and a possession being a full-fledged, like an exorcism kind of case, where, because a walk-in is an agreement, is a pact between an individual and an existing physical vessel. The existing consciousness has to subside just in the same sense that Jesus subsided and was subservient to the consciousness of Christ, and how that worked out. A walk-in is usually a higher consciousness that will willingly, again, set up a contract with another consciousness, that the consciousness already in the body has to subside to allow the other consciousness in, and that incoming consciousness becomes a dominant expression. And Abraham Lincoln is a good example of who many consider to be a walk-in, and that all the great things he accomplished were as a result of, again, some entity, if you will, this benign and beneficial spiritual entity overtaking this vessel and using it from this position of power to bring out this great expression of emancipation and freedom and understanding, and also the greenback. If we understand the political aspects, the greenback, that was very important too. Kennedy also had his experience with the money changers in that respect, although I don't think that Kennedy was a walk-in necessarily, but just to throw the money analogy out there.
Yeah, Lincoln had Mercury and Pisces in the 12th house. which is extremely psychic and open to that. But how do you know? Is that like a dead person or a spirit or how?
It may be a
The
discarnate
walk-in?
entity, or it may be a consciousness, because some consciousness, and there's supposedly there are alien entities, extraterrestrial consciousnesses that have indwelled human beings for this transition time that we're going through now, that they want to experience it through a physical body. And there's been, again, an agreement. These abduction things and these scenarios like this don't take place outside of the soul's conscious willingness. These abduction things don't happen.
Even if it's an evil entity?
Even if it's evil, even if it's negative, it's still something we agree to at the interplane level
You agree?
for learning. For
Oh.
learning. We have to learn. We have to have contrast. You can't have it all milk and honey. We have to have the negative to see the light. You have to have dark to see light, and conversely, light to see dark. So,
Well, I hope you do a show on that soon. That would be really neat.
yeah, okay, I'll have to think about that more. So,
Okay,
thanks
bye.
for your call. Take care. Hello, caller. Hello, caller. You're on the air. Go ahead.
Hey man, how you doing?
Good, yourself?
So I'm doing pretty good. What's the topic at hand here?
Today's topic is the thinning of the veil, and so I was talking about basically some of the causes for this whole restructuring that many people term the New World Order, how that worked its way through the World War, and how the veils between worlds are thinner now these days.
All right, are you a Star Wars fan?
Sure.
Can you see a direct correlation between the Star Wars saga and the events that are occurring in our nation and the events that occurred during Nazi Germany?
Very much so, and so also did, what's his name, George Lucas. He saw that. He studied metaphysical things, and you can see a lot of correlation, and you can see some of the Christian groups have jumped on that as well to make it out to portray it as negative, some of the mystical and metaphysical symbolism. But as far as a larger scale conflict of good and evil and the idea of the Force being an energy, but being neither good nor bad, it just depends on your motive as to how you use it.
I'm talking about Senator Palpatine being President Bush, and Senator Palpatine going with the Trade Federation, Afghanistan, a.k.a. the Taliban, and they attacked their own country, Naboo, which in turn led to a war between Naboo and the Trade Federation. And Senator Palpatine was behind both sides, just like he was also with Al-Qaeda and how his parents ate dinner with the Bin Laden and shit like that, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
And then in turn, he made an army of clones. And then he took over the whole entire galaxy, which is just like taking over our world, which is just like the New World Order, which you see in 4, 5, and 6. And he becomes the Emperor, President Bush, New World Order. We're all going to die soon. Oh, my God.
Well, I don't see it as being
don't
quite
cut me
that.
off. Come on,
What?
you fucking bad.
Hey, man, none of that. We don't need to be having any cursing on the show. This is a family show, and if you're going to curse, you're for sure going to get sent your way. Your analogies are good and proper, certainly, and we see oftentimes that the media is either laying out the policy for us to adhere to at some level, unconsciously or otherwise, or we see that those making the media decisions, they're aware of these things, they're reflecting reality through their art at some level, or again in some cases where they're trying to condition us. So thanks for your call. Have a nice evening. Hello, caller. You're on the air.
Hi. I wanted to comment
Sorry, I think I have.
on.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I wanted to comment on the reason for 9/11 in the inner plane. I went to a lecture that explained that, that the reason for the 9/11 was the end of duality as we understand it on Earth.
That's a very solid point. If you'll think, did they mention the symbolism between the two towers?
Yes.
And how that would be a very, very visible symbol of an end to duality or two things in existence. Mm-hmm. So that makes sense, and certainly my understanding, I don't know how much they covered it, and maybe we can compare notes a bit, but my understanding is that this energy that's available, the so-called ray energy, just as there are 7 notes before you get to the octave, there are 7 different specific colors that comprise white light. When you put them through a prism, these 7 rays, if you will, are the energy that make up all of the myriad manifestation that we see on this planet. And their mingling and their exchange makes things as they are, and we can work with these energies. And so this first ray energy, this synthetic or destructive, again, kind of like the Force, it's depending on the motive as to how you latch onto it, as to whether you're going to build or destroy from that influence. but that influence, we got a direct shot, if you will of God, the first ray influence that enacted or that enabled this activity to play out in that respect.
Excellent. Excellent.
Did that kind of jibe with what you heard in the lecture?
Well, I guess I understood it a little bit more simplistically than you, but I like the way you express yourself.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Is there anything else you care to add this evening?
Nope, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Have a nice evening. Take care.
All right, bye.
Okay, let me grab another call here. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Yeah, Corey.
Go ahead.
Okay, wasn't sure if it was me or not. Have you read the book Blindsided
No, I
by Mark
haven't.
Hazelwood?
No, I know who Hazelwood is, though. He's the guy that's bringing out the whole Nibiru, or the whole, however you
for
want
Planet X?
Right, Planet X, exactly.
I just thought I'd ask whether or not if you'd kind of looked into this. It kind of goes along with the theme that you're on tonight.
Well, okay, let me put it this way, and now to bring that in, I do see that those that wish to enslave us, those that are aware of, again, this changing of the guard, this transition period, what the Christians would term an end time or a transition time, that those individuals are very well aware of it, and so they're using many means to make this seem like a literal end time in, real time. That
Right.
This whole vaccination thing, the whole thing under the skin, the implants under the skin, that all that is a literal happening now of an end time, a revelation scenario. And so they are very much aware that they can enslave and control us by perpetuating the belief among the public that this is happening right now, right before our very eyes. But in actuality, it's just a dog and pony show. They're just using these things and their understanding of political, psychological terror and warfare to wage war on us. And in actuality, they know their time is short. They know their time is extremely short. And so they are very fearful. And that's why they have just, at all ends, they have just cranked it up. And they're really trying to hammer it home on us right now. But people are aware, people are resisting it, and people are just by understanding and changing their way of thinking, and that's a big part of it. We can change our thinking. I know that sounds simple, but just by saying no, just changing the way we think.
Sure.
And ultimately these things can be as we choose them to be. If we have a collective vision for something good and beautiful and true and positive, or a negative vision, if we reflect what we see in the media and we reflect all that negativity, that's what we're going to have. But if we look past it and look towards our opportunity to help one another and really salvage what's going on here, we can do that.
Yeah, this book is kind of getting into, the aspect of Nibiru coming around close to the Earth as far as plate tectonics,
Right,
things
right,
of
right.
that nature.
Right.
And of course, it kind of leads into the aspect of kind of the cleansing, starting of a new age, so to speak. And
Right.
of course, if people are not aware of it, all the people along the coastlines would disappear just from the rise in the waters
Right.
as plate tectonic shift. So if you get a chance to read it, I'd be curious to see what you and Jeff
Well,
and
I
the
will
rest of the
say-
guys might have to say about it.
Well, if you come to the meetings, we have fleshed that one out at the meetings before as well, and that's a good topic to bring up in those meetings as well, so we can
Okay.
lay it out pretty well. But I would say this also: anytime people assign a date to something, I don't know if you remember the Richard Noon, the May 5th, 2000 planetary alignment that he alleged was
Right.
going to lead to a lot of great cataclysm,
Right.
and that never took place. We have to understand consciousness and how consciousness, once we ascribe a date to something for one thing, it tends to lessen it and weaken it in some respects.
True.
And that's also God saying, hey, you guys, you could put a date on it, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's keeping us in check. It's divine law keeping us in check as well, to show us that, hey, we are not the be-all, end-all authorities on any of this. And for us to start ascribing dates to things and that these things are going to
It
happen,
makes it kind of tough.
hey,
to
guess
actually
again.
put a date to it.
Right.
Okay. Well, I was curious. I may come to one of y'all's meetings and kind of see who has fleshed things out in this.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay,
Take care. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Let's see, let me grab probably the last call for the evening. Go ahead, caller.
Hello?
Hi, how are you? Go ahead.
Yeah, man. Hey, are you a fan of the George Bush?
George Bush. Well, a lot of people think of George Bush as a necessary, useful puppet, tool, what have you. I look at George Bush in a couple of ways. I look at him as just looking out for his own carcass in many ways, but I also look at him again as caught up in this larger impulse that he is just serving he's just filling out his role largely outside of his understanding. He's trying to cover his own bases. He's trying to, make things nice and plush and good for himself and those around him. But I think largely he's not fully aware of the full ramifications, even though I think that he...
Okay. Well, what about Saddam Hussein? You know what I think is going to happen to Saddam Hussein?
What's that? All right, thanks for that. That was very artistic. I thank you for that. That might be a first. Okay, nonetheless, yeah, all those guys, again, they're acting on influence, and I think a lot of what they do is largely outside of their full cognizance of the real ramifications. They're just going by something that feels right to them in many respects. Although we understand, if we study history and look at some of the affiliations and organizations that George Bush has been involved in, Skull and Bones and otherwise, Bohemian Grove certainly, that it would be easy to implicate him into further nefarious activities and potentially a fuller understanding. And certainly if we factor in the bloodline too, that he is, by virtue of bloodline, related to the royal family, and that has its own implications as far as the movings and the shakings behind the scenes as to who's pulling the strings and who is making the policy that moves the world, really, and that we often find ourselves falling victim to until we decide to stand up and really say, no, we don't want these policies, and we want to make things, again, an expression of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and have goodwill and right human relations available for all men. I'm trying to grab one last call quickly. Hello, caller, you're on the air?
Yes.
Could you make this very brief, please? Hello?
Hey.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I have a question. A lot of things you're talking about, to me, it really reminds me of a lot of stuff that happened in the 60s, a lot of mass consciousness stuff, kind of questioning what is going on. And
Certainly.
I really think that this is, what you're saying is happening right now, the questioning of what we're looking at.
Oh, I lost you, caller, sorry. But yes, to flesh out that point a bit, yes, we certainly see cycles. We see the resurgence of cycles, and we see, again, yes, there is definitely that mass consciousness that it's like with the war effort too. You see, as never before, really since like Vietnam era days, mass opposition to this potential war with Iraq. And you see that wrangling and playing out. And so that's something to consider as well. But definitely, yes, you can see a resurgence of those things. Many symbols we can bring out to demonstrate that that isn't true. That is indeed true. There's a resurgence of this symbol. I'd like to remind everybody to come to the metaphysical meeting if you would like, Opal Divines. It's 8 o'clock on the 15th. Check out Jeff Contreras. His next live show will be next Tuesday at 10 on Channel 10. Thanks, Austin. Take care. Have a nice evening. Appreciate it.